평화는 이루어질 수 없고 종교인들의 대화 없이
World
종교
peace
평화는
cannot be
실현될
achieved
수
without religious
없습니다.
peace. Religious peace cannot be achieved without interfaith dialogue.
1893년
In
미국 시카고에서 열린
1893,
세계
Chicago
종교위원회에서
hosted the
세계
first
종교인들의
parliament
대화가
of the world's
시작되었고
religions,
종교
sparking
다원주의를 지지하는 운동이
interfaith
생겨났습니다.
dialogue and opening the door for religious pluralism.
1960년
In
종교인들의
1960,
대화는
the
바티칸
Second
공회를 통해
Vatican Council
종교 대화
transformed
협력
the
운동으로
interfaith
확대되었습니다.
dialogue movement into a movement for interreligious cooperation.
그리고 1970년
In
세계
1970,
종교인 평화회
the founding of the World Council of Religions for Peace
종교 협력 운동이
started the
세계로
interfaith cooperation
뻗어나갔습니다.
movement for world peace.
2000년
In
종교 협력
2000,
운동의
the
움직임은
UN and the
유엔과의 협력을
Interfaith
강화하며
Cooperation
적극적으로
Movement
종교
adopted
평화
the
운동을
Charter of
추진했고
the United
마침내
Religions
종교연합
Initiative to
이니셔티브
create
공작을
an active
채택했습니다.
movement for religious peace.
냉전 종식 이후
After
인류는
Cold War,
국경이 사라진 글로벌 시대를
humanity has
열어왔습니다.
opened the global era
세계화의
without
확산은
national borders.
협력과
The
신뢰를
spread of
바탕으로 지난
globalization based
30년
on
동안
cooperation and
물질적인
trust
번영을
has brought
가져왔고
material
인류
prosperity in the
사회를
past 30
위협하는
years.
글로벌 위기에
It became
공동으로
the
대응할 수 있는
foundation
기반이
which
되어왔습니다.
enables us to collectively respond
그러나
to global crisis.
코로나
But
바이러스의 세계적인
when the pandemic
대유행이
began,
발생한
we
후
saw how
인류가 구축한
vulnerable
사회
our
구조의
social
취약성이
structure
노출되었고
can be.
물질 우선주의가 불러온
The focus on
인간 내면의
materials
가치
has made
상실이
people lose internal
세계인들의
values.
종교적 무지와
This, in turn,
도덕적
results in
몰아넣고
religious
있습니다.
ignorance and moral hazard.
그 결과
As a
세계
result,
인류는
people in this
자원의
world
독점,
face
역사적인
monopoly of
원한,
resources,
다름을 인정하지
historical
않는
grudge,
갈등으로 인해
and conflicts
끊임없이
that do not
발생하고 있는
recognize
전쟁의
differences.
위협,
This leads to endless
세상의
dread
모든
of
생명을
war.
위협하며
All
에너지
lives
활용의
on the planet
근본적인
are
변화를
facing a
요구하고
threat
있는
which is
기후
calling
위기,
for fundamental change of energy
경제
usage
정의와
called climate
공정한
crisis.
분배를
There
이루지
is no
못해
economic
점점
justice
더
or fair
심화되어 가고 있는
distribution. As a
가난과
result,
빈곤
we witness increasing poverty.
기후 위기, 식량
Climate
위기,
crisis,
에너지
food
위기,
crisis, energy
전쟁과
crisis,
학살로
war,
더욱
and
늘어나고
massacre
있는
are
가난,
increasing the number of refugees.
인종,
Race,
성별,
gender,
민족,
ethnicity,
종교의 학벌과
religion,
자유권을 놓고
and factions and
가치
dominance.
가지고 있는
Racial
인류의
discrimination is getting worse.
그리고 코로나19 팬데믹에
As we respond to the pandemic, we witness ignorance, neglect, and greed. This is causing even more anxiety and concerns.
기후 위기,
Climate change,
빈곤,
poverty,
전쟁,
conflict,
난민,
refugees, discrimination.
오늘날 인류가 직면한
Today,
심각한 글로벌
humanity is
위기를
facing a
세계
serious
시민의
global
지성으로
crisis.
진단하고
What we need is
종교인들의
global
협력으로
citizens' intelligence
치유하고
to diagnose
회복해야 할
and
때입니다.
interreligious cooperation
코로나
to heal and
이전에 인류
recover.
세계는 세계 시민 교육이
Before the
선택이었지만
pandemic,
이제는
global citizenship
세계
education
시민
was
교육은
an option, but
필수가
now
되어야 한다라고
it is
생각합니다.
needed.
저희 종교연합 세계 시민 회의는 지구적 위기에 대한 공동 대응과
What
문제
direction
해결을 위한
should the
국제적 표준이 될
conference
수 있는
go in
윤리와
order
도덕을
to build a
재검토해
sustainable
가고자
peace and
합니다.
prosperity
이러한 노력을
in the
통해서
era?
풍요로운
With our
인류의
efforts,
미래를 열어가기 위한
how do we
물질
build
문명과 정신
prosperity
문명의
and how do
조화를
we
추구해 갈 수
have
있는
harmony
세계
between
시민
material and
집단 지성이
mentality? We
구축되기를
need
바랍니다.
collective intelligence in this world.
인류에게는 시간이 많이 남아있지 않습니다.
We have no more time to wait.
코로나19 팬데믹과 새로운 냉전 체제가 불러오는
What
전쟁의
direction
위협
should the
속에서
United Religions
지속
go
가능한 평화와
in order
인류
to
번영의
build a
미래를
sustainable
만들기 위해
peace and prosperity
종교
in
연합
the
운동이
era
나아가야
of the
할 방향은
pandemic and the new
무엇일까요?
Cold War?
종교의 역할과 인류의 미래를 탐구하는
The journey to
세계
explore
시민들의
the
여정이
future and the role of
종교연합
religion
세계 시민 회의를
begins
통해
now
지금
at the
시작됩니다.
2022 Interfaith Coalition Conference for Global Citizens.
안녕하십니까. 지금부터
Hello,
2022년
everyone.
종교연합 세계 시민회의를 시작하겠습니다.
We will now begin the
저는 사회를
Interfaith
맡게
Coalition
된
Conference
종교연합
for Global
청년단
Citizens
전혜복이라고
2022.
합니다.
My name is
반갑습니다.
Chun Hye-bok and I will serve as an MC today. It is nice to
어느덧
meet you today.
3년째를 맞이한 종교연합 세계
This year,
시민회의에
we
올해도
celebrate
여러
the third
출연자분들과
anniversary of
패널분들을 모시고
Iccgc. We are
뜻깊은
joined
시간을
by many
갖게 되어
speakers and
참으로 기쁘게
panelists to
생각이
hold this
됩니다.
meaningful event.
올해에는
This
종교와
year,
문명
our
모두를
theme
위한
is
사회의
religions
정의와
and
치유를
civilizations,
주제로
social
10월
justice and
8일부터
healing for
9일
all.
양일간
We have 2
온라인으로
days
진행이
and it
됩니다.
will be held online.
시간이 갈수록
As time
우리는 뗄래야 뗄
passes,
수 없는
I feel
하나의
like
세계에
we are
살고
indeed
있음을
living
느끼게
in a
됩니다.
world that cannot
다른
be
나라의
separated.
고통이 더 이상 남의 나라 이야기일 수만은 없는
We go
것이죠.
beyond the national
국가라는
borders,
우를 넘어 하나의 세계로
and
연결되어 가고 있는
we are being
것입니다.
connected in the one world.
국제사회는 그간에는 물질적인
International
번영을
community
일으켜왔습니다.
has achieved
하지만
material
최근 들어서는
prosperity,
그간의
and
물질 문명의
we
발전에
responded
감추어져
to global
있던 기후
crisis. More
문제라던가
recently, we
인간
found
내면의
out about
무지질병
climate issues
빈곤으로 인해
and
야기된
problems
현대의 위기에
such
대해서
as
생각해보고
poverty,
성찰을
ignorance, and
해보게
disease.
됩니다.
This makes us think more about
종교계에서는
contemporary
이러한 대위기
crisis.
극복을 위하여 정신
Religions
문명과
have a
물질
mission
문명 간
to
조화를
overcome the
이루어
crisis.
전
We need
지구적
harmony
위기에
between
공동
mentality and
대응하고
material.
또
We need
적극적으로
collective
해결책을
response to
마련해야
global
하는
crisis, and we
사명감을
need
가지게
solutions for
되었습니다.
many problems.
문명의 시대 속 종교 그리고
We have
모두를 위한
religion,
사회의 정의와 치유
social
이러한
justice, and
고민
healing
속에서
in our
여러
agenda.
종교에서 한 마음으로
How can
해결의 길을
religions
찾고 힘을
seek
합치기
solution
위하여
together?
오늘의 자리를
Today's
마련했습니다.
event will be where we find
본
collective
행사의
response.
후원, 주관, 주최 협력사를 소개해
Let
드리겠습니다.
me
본
introduce who
행사는
made this event
원불교 구정원
possible.
국제부, 원불교
This event
유엔사무소,
is co-organized
원광대학교
by the One Buddhism
종교문제연구소,
UN Office, the
미국
Research
불교
Center for
기독교
Religions at
연구학회가
Wonkwang
주최하며
University, the
종교연합
Society
세계
for
시민회의
Buddhist Christian Studies,
사무국에서
and the
주관, 세계
Interfaith
불교도
Coalition
청년의회,
Conference for
원불교
Global
종교연합운동
Citizens. There is
추진위원회,
collaboration
사단법인
with the World Fellowship
평화협력,
of Buddhist Youth, the
문화치유관광부,
One Buddhism
원불교
Committee for
문화사회부,
United
종교연합
Religions,
후원재단,
and the
원음방송,
Quirk
원불교 신문사,
Groups
한우란
Peace. It
신문사에서
is
후원을
sponsored by the
해주셨습니다.
Ministry
줌과
of Culture,
유튜브를
Sport and
통해서
Tourism
양일간
and the One Buddhism
생중계됩니다.
Department of
본
Culture and Society
행사는
as
동시
well.
통역 서비스가
This
제공이
event is
됩니다.
live streamed
줌을
today and tomorrow.
통해서는
We have
한국어와
simultaneous
영어로
interpretation in
시청이
English and Korean.
가능하십니다.
You
화면
can choose to
하단에
listen to
메뉴 버튼을
interpretation on
누르시고
Zoom,
듣고 싶으신 언어를
and you can
선택하실
choose
수가
your
있습니다.
language.
유튜브를
On
통해서는
YouTube,
한국어로 양일간 송출이 됩니다.
we will have live streamed event for
이어서는
2 days in
정재경
Korean.
원불교 교무님의
And
진행으로
now we
세계
will be
평화
joined by
기도 1분
Reverend
묵념
Jung
시간을
Jae-kyung, who will share a
가지겠습니다.
moment of opening prayer and 1 minute of silence.
오늘도 우리를 온전히 존재할 수 있게
I
하시는
want to
모든
extend
은혜에
my gratitude
감사드리며
to the grace
세계의
that
평화를
allows
위해
our
함께
existence.
기도합니다.
We pray for world peace
온 인류가
together.
마음을 합하여 세계의
Let the
모든
humanity
무지,
join hearts to
빈곤,
overcome
질병을
ignorance,
벗어날 수 있게
poverty,
하소서.
and disease.
온 인류가
Let the
마음을
humanity
합하여
join hearts
세계의 모든
to end
전쟁이
all
종식될
wars
수
in
있게
the world.
하소서. 온 인류가
Let the
마음을
humanity join
합하여
hearts
세계의 모든 기후
to
위기가
overcome all
극복될 수 있게
climate
하소서.
crisis in the world.
내 나라 위주로, 인간의 위주로,
We
나의
repent
위주로
for
살아온
putting our
지난날을
nations first,
참회하고
putting humans first,
모두에게
and putting
평등한 은혜를
myself first.
나눠주시는
We
하늘과
extend our
땅과 바람의
gratitude to the
존재에
heaven, earth,
감사하며
and the wind for
지혜로운
sharing equal
생각과
grace for
바른
all.
실천으로
With wise thought
세계의
and
평화를
right
앞당길 수
practice,
있도록
let us
함께
work
노력하게
together to bring
하소서.
global peace early.
모든 세계인들의
Fill
마음에
our
더욱
hearts
큰
with
평화와
bigger
안식이
peace
가득하게
and
하소서.
bigger rest.
이어서는 종교연합 세계시민회의 의장이시자 조지타운
Next, we
대학교의
will listen
레오
to welcoming
루페비루
remarks by
교수님의
Reverend
환영사가
Dr. Leo
있겠습니다.
Lefebvre.
It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to this year's convening of the Interfaith Conference for Global Citizens. Our focus this year is on religions and civilizations, social justice, and healing for all. To introduce this topic, I would like to invoke the call presented many, many years ago by Iccgc, a great Buddhist leader who lived in 6th century China at the confluence of the country's great religious traditions. His father was a Confucian scholar, and his mother's family had long practiced Taoism. He became a Buddhist leader, respected and revered by the Tiantai, Chan, and Pure Land traditions. Iccgc's voice resounds through the centuries to us with the command, stop and see. In his influential lectures entitled Great Stopping and Seeing, or Great Calming and Contemplation, Iccgc calls us to stop our delusions, stop our usual way of grasping, and see the reality of all beings with clear-eyed wisdom and respond with compassion. Iccgc promises us stopping and seeing is enlightenment. Enlightenment is stopping and seeing. In other words, when we stop the delusion that leads to ceaseless craving and hatred, we can learn to see reality as it is and avoid danger. He tells us, it is like when you light a lamp in a dark room. The darkness cannot claim rights over the room and cannot refuse to go just because it has been there for a long time. As soon as the lamp is lit, the darkness vanishes. I am confident that our speakers in this conference will explore this challenge skillfully from many different directions. Thank you.
다음은 오늘의 이 자리를 축하해
Next,
주시기 위한
Mr.
최은상
Eun-sang Chae, the
종교연합 후원
chairperson of
재단
United Religions
이사장님의
Foundation, will
축사가
deliver
있겠습니다.
congratulatory address.
반갑습니다.
Nice to meet you
세계
all.
각지
I
그리고
sincerely
한국에서
welcome
종교
you
간의
all to
갈등을
Interfaith
종식하고
Coalition Conference for Global
새로운 평화
Citizens
세계를 열고자 하는
2022,
굳은
who
의지로
came with a strong commitment to end
2022
conflicts between
종교연합
religions
세계
in Korea
시민회의에
and around the world and open a
참석하신
new
모든
world
분들
of
진심으로
peace.
환영합니다.
Welcome everyone.
코비드-19 이후로
Buddhists
국제사회의
and
혼란을 경험한
intellectuals who have
지도자들과
experienced chaos in the international
시민들은 흩어지고
community
나눠지고
during the COVID-19
달라진
era
세상과
have
문명의
been
위기를
contemplating
세계의
on
시민의
how we
기제를
can overcome the
극복하고자 고민을
crisis under
해왔습니다.
the notion of global
특히
citizen in the
올해
world and
3회째를 맞이하는
civilizations that have been
행사는
scattered, divided, and
종교와
separated.
문명,
This year we hold the
모두를
third
위한
conference
사회
and open the
정의와
first day
치유의
with the
주제로
theme of
첫날을
religions and
시작하게 되었습니다.
civilizations, social justice, and
올해
healing for
특별히
all.
공동 주최로 함께 해주신
I'd like to express my
SBCS
sincere gratitude to
미국
our
불교
co-organization,
기독교 연구학회와 협력팀으로 세션을
SBCS, the
맡아주신
Study for
세계
Buddhist Christian
불교도
Studies, and our
청년의회에
collaborators, World Fellowship of Buddhist Youth, for hosting one of the sessions.
진심으로 깊은 감사를
And my
보내며
thanks go to
어려운
the
일정
One
속에도
Buddhism UN Office, the
지속적으로
Coast
함께
Peace, the
해주신
Research Center for
원불교
Religions,
유엔사무소,
Wongang
사단법인
University,
평화,
and our
원광대학교
sponsors,
종교문제연구소,
and the
더불어
Ministry of
후원해주신
Culture, Sports, and
문화체육관광부,
Tourism of Korea,
원음방송 및 종교연합
WBS, One Buddhism
후원재단
Broadcasting,
모든
and the United
분들께도 감사
Religions
인사드립니다.
Foundation.
종교연합 세계 시민회의
Today's event
3회째를
marks the
맞이하는
third
행사는
anniversary of the
유엔
Interfaith
세계
Coalition
평화의
Conference
날,
for Global
공식
Citizens.
주제와
The
연결된
conference starts with a
인종주의
sub-theme of
종식과
End
평화
Racism,
구축의
Building
소주제로
Peace, which is
시작합니다.
in line with the official
이어서
theme of UN International
유엔
Day of
종교화합
Peace.
주간의 공식
It will be
주제,
followed by the official
글로벌
theme
대화
of
주제,
UN World Interfaith
종교와
Harmony
문명의
Week,
위기를
Global
넘어
Dialogue, Global
글로벌
Challenge,
도전과
and
종교적
religious
대응 및
responses
미래를
that
향해
go
함께
beyond the
나아가는
crisis of
내용입니다.
religion and civilizations and our
오늘의
passage
이
toward the
소중한
future.
대담과 토론으로
I hope
코로나
today's
이후
insightful
인류
discourse
사회가
and
당면한
discussions will lead
고통과
us to
단절에
overcome
대하여
the suffering and
세계
disconnection
시민의
faced by the
하나된
humanity since the
의식으로
pandemic
급격하고
and restore
평화롭고
morality
행복한
and
세계를 이루기
universalize
위해
world ethics to
도덕을
achieve a
회복하고
peaceful and happy
세계
world
윤리를
under the
보편화하며
notion of united
지속
global
가능한
citizens
인류의
and
미래를
open the
열어가기를
sustainable future
응원합니다.
of the whole humanity.
저도
종교연합 후원재단
As the
이사장 및
chairperson of United Religious
국가의
Foundation,
기업인이자
an entrepreneur,
시민의
and a
일원으로
citizen of a
평화의
country,
소중한
I
씨앗을
will
심어가는
join
이
all of
자리에
you on our
지속적으로
pathway
함께
where we
하도록
plant
하겠습니다.
valuable seeds of
함께
peace.
하신
I
모든
send my
분들의
sincere
소중한
support and
의견이 모여
congratulations.
새로운
I hope
세상,
valuable opinions
지속 가능한
discussed here
인류의
would lead
미래를
to a new world
열어나가시길
and open up a
진심으로
sustainable
응원하고
future
축하
for the
인사를
mankind.
드립니다.
이어서는 평화 메시지
Next, we will
시간입니다.
hear the peace
아시아
message
종교평화회의 김성곤
from Dr. Song-gun
명예회장님이
Kim, the
보내오신
president
평화
of Asian
메시지를
Conference of
이어서
Religions of
듣도록
Peace.
하겠습니다.
반갑습니다. 먼저
Nice to meet you
2022년
all.
종교연합 세계시민회의 개최를
Congratulations on
진심으로
holding the
축하드립니다.
2022 Interfaith Coalition
지난
Conference for
3년간
Global
인류는
Citizens.
전대미문의
In
코로나
the past 3
팬데믹으로
years,
많은
humanity
희생자가
faced the
생기고
pandemic, which
또
resulted in many
생활의
victims
행동이
and
제한되는 등
limitations in
참으로
daily
힘든 시간을
activities.
보냈습니다. 물질 문명의 발달로 인해
We
인류가 더
expected that
행복해질
we'll be
것을
happier
기대했지만
with the progress of
오히려 산업화로
civilization,
인한 환경
but
파괴는
environmental destruction due
기후변화를
to
초래했고 이는
industrialization
악성
resulted in
바이러스의
climate change.
출현을 만들어
In the end, we
결과적으로
met a
인류는
virus
더
that made
불행해진
people
것
less
같습니다.
happy.
새로운 백신의 개발로
People say that
코로나19를
development of
극복했다고
vaccine
하지만
makes us overcome
팬데믹의
the
근본
pandemic,
원인인 환경 파괴를
but unless
해결하지
we
못하는
resolve the
한
problem with
우리 인류는
environmental
앞으로 또
destruction,
다른
we might see
악성
another
바이러스의
virus
출현으로
affecting the
고통받게 될 것입니다.
humanity.
따라서 우리 인류는
In turn,
코로나 팬데믹을
we should
자연이
consider
우리에게
the
주는
pandemic
고마운
as a
경고로
warning from
받아들이고
nature.
인류의 삶을
We should turn
근본적으로
this
바꾸는
into an
계기를
opportunity
만들어야 할 것
to
같습니다.
fundamentally change the pattern of our lives.
더구나 코로나 팬데믹이 아시아에서
Moreover,
시작했다는 이유로
because the pandemic began
미국과
in
유럽
Asia,
등지에서
many Asian
아시아인들이
people
테러를
suffered
당하는
racial discrimination
인종차별을
in
경험했습니다.
countries in Europe and the United States.
또한 개발된 백신이 부자 나라의
Vaccines were developed,
국민들로부터
but they were
접종되고
mainly provided
가난한
to
나라의
those in
국민들이
wealthy
소외되면서
countries. Poor
인류는 다시
countries were
한번
marginalized,
지구촌의
and we
빈부 차이를
witnessed the divide
경험했습니다.
between the rich and the poor.
최근 기후변화로 인한
As we saw
파키스탄의
from the recent
대홍수에서
devastating
보았듯이
floods in
물질
Pakistan
문명의 최대
resulting from
피해는
climate
결국
change,
가난한
the
나라,
biggest side effect
가난한
and damage from
계층들에게
the
돌아가고 있습니다.
civilization is borne by the
우리는
poor
이
countries
불평등한
and the poor
구조를
people.
어떻게
How can we
치유해야
fix
할까요?
such an unequal structure?
종교의 가장 중요한 기능은
The most important role
정의와
religion can
사랑을
play
사랑하는
is building
인간
a society
그리고
where
그것이
justice
제대로
is
구현되는
realized
사회를
by
만드는
people
것입니다.
practicing justice and love.
불교나 기독교나
Buddhism,
그리고
Christianity,
이슬람교나
Islam,
모든 종교는
they all
정의를 강조하고
emphasize
있고
justice
또 부자나
and teach
가난한
that
사람이다
we should love
모두를
everyone,
차별
whether
없이
they are rich
사랑하라고
or
가르치고
poor,
있습니다.
without any
오히려
discrimination.
종교는
Religion should
강자보다는
take the weak side
약자의 편에
rather than the
서야 할 것
strong.
같습니다. 또 종교는
Religion
정신이 물질의
warns
노예가 되는
us
것을
of our
경고하고
spirit becoming a slave
물질적
to
행복보다는
materials. And
정신적
religion
행복을
values
더 가치
spiritual
있게
happiness
여기고 있습니다.
instead of materialistic happiness.
이런 면에서 지금 인류는
In this
종교의
respect,
역할과
humanity
가치에
should
대해서
contemplate
다시
on
한번
the role
깊이
and
생각해 볼
value
때입니다.
of religion once again.
종교가 외형적 발전에 급급하여
We should ask
그 근본
ourselves whether
정신을
we have
잃어버리고 있는
forgotten
것이
the
아닌지
fundamental spirit of
인류
religious
사회가 이렇게 병들어 있는 것은
community being swayed
또
by
종교의
developing its
책임은 아닌지
institutions or how
스스로
it
반문해
looks.
볼
And
필요가
we should
있습니다.
question the accountability of religion for
코로나
the ills of
팬데믹으로
our
인해
world.
물질 문명의
If the
폐해와
pandemic could provide an
현대인의
opportunity
불행의
for
원인을
us to
돌아보고
reflect
그
on the
치유의
harms of
방법을
materialism
찾아갈 수
and
있다면
root cause of despair
코로나
in the modern
팬데믹은
society,
우리에게 또
and if we can
하나의
find a way for healing,
감사한
taking this
기회가
opportunity,
될
even the
것입니다.
pandemic could be a gift for us
경청해
endowed
주셔서
by the heaven.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
이어서는 기조 연설을
Next is
청하겠습니다.
Kenneth's speech.
현대에는 문명의 발전과
Along
또
with
최근
advancement
들어서는
in
코로나로 인하여
civilization and the
다양한
recent
위기에
COVID pandemic, the
봉착했습니다.
current world is
이러한
facing various
인류의 위기
crises.
극복을 위하여
To overcome
종교계를
such
향해
crisis of the
해결책과
humanity,
대응
many
방안을
people are
요청하는
looking to the
목소리가
religious
날로 커져가고
community for the
있습니다.
solutions and responses.
우리는 이 시점에
At this
종교의
juncture,
참된
we
역할에
need to
대하여
contemplate on the
생각해보고
true role of
더불어
religion.
모두를 위한 사회
And religion
정의와
should take one step
그리고
further
치유를
and
위하여
take the lead in
종교계가
making
한
the
걸음
social
더
change
나아가
to
사회
realize social
변화의 주체가
justice
되어야 할
and
시점이라고
healing.
볼 수 있습니다. 이러한
In
견지에서
this
오늘의
context,
기조
the
연설을
Kenneth speech will
준비했습니다.
address
기조
religions
연설의
and
주제는 종교와 문명
civilizations,
모두를 위한 사회의 정의와 치유입니다.
social justice and
연사로는
healing for
마크
all.
유노 미국 불교
And we
기독교 학회
have
회장님이시자
Mark Yuno,
오레온 대학교 교수님으로
the
계신
president of
마크 유노
Society for Buddhist
교수님을
Christian
모셨습니다.
Studies and
그러면
professor of
지금부터 기조
University of
연설을 청해
Oregon. We'll listen
듣겠습니다.
to the Kenneth speech first.
Thank you very much. 안녕하세요. 매우 감사합니다. The theme for this year's Interfaith Coalition Conference for Global Citizens, Religions and Civilizations, Social Justice and Healing for All, is on the one hand timely and ideally suited for this occasion, and on the other presents a daunting task, before which I am humbled and honored to address all of you. And I would like to thank all of our co-sponsors and collaborators for making this wonderful opportunity possible for all of us. There's a number of themes I'd like to explore with you, but in particular, I would like to explore possible differences between a purely secular political engagement with issues of social justice and healing on the one hand, and a religious engagement on the other, especially as it concerns Mahayana Buddhism and the Bodhisattva vow, and the need for deep listening in the context of social justice and healing. It's primarily on these last two themes that I wish to focus my remarks today. That is, the difference between secular and religious engagements with issues of social justice, focusing on the Bodhisattva vow, and the need for deep listening. I would like to begin with a passage from a letter written by the great American playwright, Tennessee Williams. He writes, "Nobody sees anybody truly, but all through the flaws of their own egos. That is the way we all see each other in life. Vanity, fear, desire, competition, all such distortions within our own egos condition our vision of those in relation to us. Add to those distortions to our own egos the corresponding distortions in the egos of others, and you can see how cloudy the glass must become through which we look at each other. That's how it is in all living relationships, except when there is that rare case of two people who love intensely enough to burn through all those layers of opacity and see each other's naked hearts," unquote. It's a reflection Williams offers about the difficulty of truly seeing one another honestly due to the distortions of our own ego attachments. Yet without seeing each other, we cannot connect deeply. Without connecting deeply, we cannot truly love. And without truly loving one another, we cannot heal. Yet in this historical moment, the world could not be more divided. Ukraine withstanding invasion by Russia, the USA versus China, the rich versus the poor, and a world of increasing income and wealth inequality. Liberal versus conservative. Of course, there are so many more issues. In such a world, how can we truly see each other beyond our own ego distortions? How can we connect and love each other deeply? I have great admiration and respect for my colleagues in Won Buddhism, who I look forward to learning from in this conference. One of the newer forms of Buddhism that arose in such a milieu to tackle both social and spiritual suffering. Less encumbered by adherence to traditional forms of social hierarchy and institutional ties to royal and imperial forms of government, these new forms of Buddhism vigorously tackled issues of poverty and related forms of social inequality, such as gender inequality. They not only embraced these issues in a principled manner, but led by example, with women as well as men rising to positions of leadership. And in the case of Japan, we find something similar with the work of new religions such as Rishoko Sekai. On the one hand, Won Buddhism, although a newer form of Buddhism, is firmly established on the basis of Mahayana Buddhism, with such scriptures as the Diamond Sutra forming a foundation, with the deeper truths of emptiness of words and the oneness of reality as its foundation, on the one hand, and the realization of this oneness in the realm of form, this world of appearances, on the other. Along with this twofold truth of form and emptiness, the world of appearances, and the realization of the deep flow of the oneness of reality, there is the Bodhisattva vow, the universal vow liberating all beings from suffering. The Bodhisattva vow goes hand in hand with the twofold truth. When one realizes the emptiness of words, then the categories that tend to divide us, man, woman, Asian, Western, Buddhist, Christian, all begin to dissolve, and with it the conflicts that can arise when we cling too much to the ideas we have. Then eventually we can realize that all peoples, in fact all beings, are one with me deep within, and I'm naturally moved to realize this in my daily life, in this world of appearances. Thus, when we see social justice in the form of social and economic inequality or gender discrimination, we want to dissolve the conflicts that arise from such injustice, to realize our oneness with all peoples, with the entire human family, and ultimately with all creatures, human and non-human. While one can see how the Bodhisattva vow of Mahayana Buddhism lends itself to application in the realm of social justice, we need to take a closer look to see if there are problems that might arise in applying this Buddhist notion to social justice concerns, which have been formulated predominantly in terms of Western thinking. When we consider social justice movements in the West, there are two features we can readily identify. First is concern for giving voice to and addressing the injustices suffered by those who have been overlooked, oppressed, and whose voices have been suppressed. Second is the affirmation of the value of life of those who have been oppressed and discriminated against. For example, women did not have the right to vote in many countries until the 20th century. More recently, sexual harassment and sexual assault have gained much greater attention, for example, in the US, through the Me Too and Time's Up movements. Although men have been significant allies in these movements, these issues concerning women and gender would not have received the attention they did without women spearheading the women's suffrage movement and without women speaking up and finding their voice on issues of sexual violence. This is also true for issues of racism, as we can see all the way from the civil rights movement in the US from the 1960s and such movements as Black Lives Matter today. In both cases of women's rights and racial justice, what was being overlooked was the value of human life, women's lives, Black lives, the lives of others as well, of sexual identity and orientation, and of peoples of color. I believe that the Bodhisattva vow of Mahayana Buddhism includes these social concerns. At the same time, when we look more closely, we can notice some differences between the social justice movements that have arisen in modernity and the classical formulation of the Bodhisattva vow. In its classical formulation, which we find in many Mahayana Buddhist scriptures, there are two characteristics of the vow that stand out. First, the Bodhisattva vow brings all beings to liberation before they themselves achieve liberation. Everybody else goes first before the Bodhisattva. Second, the goal of liberation is to become freed from the suffering of samsara, the realm of life and death. That is, this kind of Buddhist awakening occurs at the level of the deepest truth of emptiness and cosmic oneness, beyond the distinctions of life and death, and the realization of the deep flow of the oneness of reality before the application of human ideas of life and death. While the material and social needs of all peoples, indeed all sentient beings, are included in the Bodhisattva vow, the central focus is on the spiritual or religious liberation of no longer being bound by the attachments that plague us in this world of appearances, even attachment to life. In order to realize the spiritual freedom beyond life and death, the Bodhisattva vow vows to lead all beings to liberation and only achieve liberation for themselves after all others go first. The reason for this is firmly rooted in the realization of emptiness and oneness. It makes no sense for me to declare myself enlightened, awakened, or liberated when there are others who have yet to attain this liberation. Just as it makes no sense for a loving family member, say a parent, to declare themselves happy if there is even one unhappy member of the family, say a child. The Bodhisattva only achieves spiritual fulfillment when all beings do so. That is because, like a loving parent views their children as inseparable from themselves, the realization of oneness beyond words, all beings are the self of the Bodhisattva. Here we can see there can be differences between some secular views of social justice and the Buddhist vision of the Bodhisattva vow. In secular social justice movements, It's necessary for people to speak up for themselves and their own social group. Yet the Bodhisattva vow is to ensure that all others go first, addressing one's own personal or particular suffering. Does this mean that modern social justice movements are incompatible with the Mahayana vision of the Bodhisattva vow? I don't think so. That might be the case if we see them on the same plane, but if we understand that there's more than one level of engagement, then not only do we avoid unnecessary contradictions, we can see that the two levels, social justice movements in the modern world, and the deep vow of the Bodhisattva are complementary and can be mutually enhancing. I was very moved to read an essay by Reverend Dr. Grace Song of Won Buddhism. Deep listening as a way to create spaces of belonging. She writes, quote, "One of the lessons from living in the time of COVID-19 is that it's easy to fall into a life that feels invisible and disconnected from others. On the one hand, we recognize that we're all in this together in the event of a pandemic, but we can still detect a waning sense of shared humanity. Fear can generate an us versus them mentality, which tends to reinforce feelings of isolation and disconnection. What we do know is that we are social beings who have an unavoidable need to feel true love and belonging, and that when we don't have either, we suffer." She goes on to cite the words of the late great Vietnamese master Thich Nhat Hanh. "Deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of another person." Reverend Dr. Grace Wong continues, "Deep listening allows us to hold space for people to share their most authentic selves without compromising who they are. It is true compassion to listen without controlling what is being said. When we release the need to control the situation, we start to truly hear and open our eyes to who's there in front of us, which requires complete involvement. We can't be lost in thinking or in our inner discourse and still listen fully. An active listener asks herself, am I here? Am I quiet inside so that I can hear you? Am I allowing you to fully express yourself? It's important to find our voice, to let the world know when we have been overlooked, neglected, abused. At the same time, we need to make space for deep listening to others, as all beings are subject to suffering. And in the vision of Mahayana Buddhism, all beings belong in the great circle of great compassion." In addition to reading Reverend Dr. Grace Song's wonderful essay, I also found a helpful essay by Buddhist teacher and racial justice advocate Valerie Brown. She writes, "In 1995, I attended a public talk given by Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh. Everything Thich Nhat Hanh was saying was the opposite of how I was living my life. I was very type A, aggressive, bunker mentality, hard as nails person, just running from tremendous internalized oppression and internalized racism. I walked out of the talk thinking, that guy, who is that guy? That day touched me, touched something within me, a spark in me, and I started to practice meditation. So I started practicing this and I decided, okay, let me actually practice this at work when I'm in the halls of the Congress of the United States. Now, I'm a Black woman with dark skin, with dreadlocks, talking to a very conservative person who may be white from quite a racially segregated area. What I would do when I'm in that conversation with such a person who, on one level, my mind perceives to be the opposite of who I am, is I turn to my breathing. And I would just notice how I'm breathing and feel my feet on the floor. And I'd say these words to myself, soften, soften, soften. And my whole body would start softening. And then what I noticed is that instead of trying to persuade the other person, because this is the job of the lobbyist, to be persuasive, I would switch that. I would take sincere, genuine interest in understanding the other person first. Even if I believe that person was way far out on the opposite end of how I feel, I would ask the person, tell me more. Help me understand. How are you doing, really? I would open my mouth until it could come out sincere. And what happened then was that the other person would soften up. The dynamic between us became relational rather than adversarial. That was the form of mindfulness that was interpersonal. That was being peace, conveying peace, beginning to bring healing in a context where social justice was at stake. For Valerie Brown, the conservative white man she was faced with initially represented the enemy, emblematic of her long history of oppression at the hands of white racism, white patriarchy. Yet following the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, she approached this man with mindfulness, openness, softening into a posture of deep listening. By setting aside her own preconceptions, like a bodhisattva, she was putting him first. By putting him first, she opened the possibility for greater understanding, not just for him, but that he might also be less defensive, and he possibly open to her. I want to share with you one more story about a young woman named Mayumi Tsuruchi in Japan and a young violinist. In 2003, I had the opportunity to be visiting professor in the psychotherapy program at Kyoto University in Japan. As it happened, Kyoto University was serving as host for the annual meeting of the Japanese Association for Clinical Psychology, and I was asked to be respondent for a panel of papers presented by graduate students. And I would just like to comment on one case, which was presented by a PhD student at Kyoto University, Ms. Mayumi Tsuruchi. This was a case of genetic counseling, which involves DNA testing for hereditary disease. For example, if there's a history of breast cancer in a woman's family, she can be tested to see if there's a high probability of contracting breast cancer. One can have one's breast removed before contracting cancer in order to minimize the risk. A well-known case is that of the actress Angelina Jolie, who had both breasts removed, even though she did not yet have cancer. Thus, the decision to have the DNA test itself can be life-changing. So it's standard to require counseling before taking the DNA test or have genetic testing. Ms. Tsuruchi was assigned as a counselor at a middle school, and this is the story of a student who came in for genetic counseling before she had the DNA test done. The middle school student was raised in a supportive environment where she could freely explore her interests. When her music teachers noticed that she showed a strong interest in classical music and some ability, she was encouraged to explore further, and she took up the violin. She progressed quickly, and her teacher, recognizing her potential, introduced her to the best violin teacher in the area, and she took her to hear concerts whenever there was a famous violinist performing. The student freely pursued her dream of becoming a virtuoso violinist, immersing herself 24/7. Yet there was a history of adult onset deafness in her maternal line, so she was told that she could have a DNA test for this condition. She was counseled about the possible consequences, and she decided to go ahead and have the test. She waited several weeks for the results, and the doctor told her that the likelihood of her becoming deaf as an adult was 100%. When she went for her first post-diagnosis counseling session with Ms. Tsuruchi, the graduate student who was assigned to her as a counselor, she remained completely silent until finally when she said, "When I received the results of the test, I died." She didn't say, "I felt like I died." She said, "I died." And when one thinks about it, this makes perfect sense. She had been living, breathing, and dreaming of being a violinist. Her whole life was about being a violinist. And now this dream had been destroyed. Her sense of freedom to be herself had been completely taken away. And she faced the ultimate darkness, brokenness, the death of the self. When she said, "I died," the graduate student counselor, Ms. Tsuruchi, was at a loss for words. And she too remained silent. Thereafter, the middle school student came for her weekly counseling session once a week. But each time, both she and her counselor remained silent, as neither really had anything to say. Finally, after a few months, the student finally spoke. "I've decided to go visit the graves of my grandmother and great aunt who had become deaf. When she came back from the Buddhist cemetery for her next appointment, she said something along the following lines. When I first stood in front of the graves of my grandmother and great aunt, I was so sad, upset, even angry. I said to them, "Why did you give me such a wonderful gift, only to take it away?" But as she was talking to her maternal ancestors, the young student began to hear their voices, as it were, and she began to realize how much her grandmother and great aunt suffered. There was no counseling for them. How much prejudice and discrimination they must have faced. She began to see their suffering as her own. She told her counselor, for the first time, she began to realize the deep life connection, what in Japanese she expressed as inochi no kizuna, that she had with them. And now she did not know what she was going to do, but her maternal ancestors, her grandmother, her great aunt, had given her the courage to move forward with her life. And even if she did not know what she would do, she was looking forward to discovering what life had in store for her as she made her way forward. This counselor was a graduate student at Kyoto University, one of the best universities in Japan. So she certainly had superior academic ability and must have known many theories and practices of psychotherapy and counseling. Yet, in the face of this young woman who said to her, "I died," she could not utter a single word. What's important here is that she continued to be present with this middle school student, even as she remained silent, listening deeply, even as they both must have felt uncomfortable because of this. Yet the counselor never wavered in her attitude of reaching out with open hands, open mind, open heart, of listening deeply for whatever the students had to say, even if she could not find the words, and even if the communication occurred only through silence. The graduate student refused to cover things over by filling the space in the counseling room with her academic knowledge. Instead, she acknowledged within herself that she did not know what to do. In a sense, she transcended any defined framework of psychotherapy and simply became herself, a limited human being, a foolish being, sitting before her client, who herself went far beyond her years as a middle school girl, and perhaps influenced by a Buddhist background, manifested her true, inconceivable self. As long as the young girl felt free to pursue her career as a violinist, she only had ears for the sound of music. Isn't it ironic then that for this young girl to truly hear the voiceless voice of her maternal ancestors, she had to receive the news of her inevitable deafness? In the critical moment of encounter, the counselor and the middle school student both became aware of their profound brokenness and thereby became open to the inconceivable illumination of the universe itself. In Buddhism, we would say the Dharma of emptiness and oneness. They forgot who they thought they were supposed to be, and they became fully present to each other. The young girl was enabled to pass through a kind of death, to be reborn at a deeper level of realizing what it means to be truly, fully human. As the Zen master Dogen states, to learn the Buddha way, the way of awakening to be fully human, is to learn to be oneself. To learn to be oneself is to forget the self. That is, any preconceived ideas about who I think I am or should be. This is to realize a kind of beginner's mind, returning to simplicity beyond words. This was a level of deep listening, deep hearing, that both the counselor and the young student, beyond sights and sounds, beyond life and death, and led to the young student's rebirth arising from the deepest reality of the self, beyond words, in the deep flow of the oneness of reality. So in conclusion, I can say there are times we have to speak up for ourselves and our communities. We have to take a firm stand against the dark forces of destruction. But deep in our hearts of social justice, the vision of Mahayana Buddhism holds that a true healing will only occur when we plumb the depths of our own darkness, our own blindness, until we realize the deep flow of the oneness that heals all of our hearts together as one heart. I believe such a view is not limited to Buddhism, but can be found in other religious paths as well. And that is the common ground that the Buddhist master Thich Nhat Hanh found with the great Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who in turn found common ground with Gandhi. Deep in our hearts is the aspiration to realize magnanimous mind, that generosity of a heart that is boundless, the heart of great compassion and cosmic healing that includes all religions, all those who aspire for justice, Black, brown, red, white, Asian, women, men, people of all cultures and walks of life, all creatures, human and non-human, even the sun, the stars, and the moon, all of whom are our brothers and sisters, our mothers and fathers, from the ancient past to the limitless future. To return to the words of Tennessee Williams I cited earlier, may we all, quote, love intensely enough to burn through all those ego-centered layers of opacity and see each other's naked hearts, unquote. I feel that I have received with such boundless kindness and generosity to be invited here to speak before you. Thank you for this opportunity to be inspired and to learn. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
마크 윤우 교수님의 기조 연설
So that was the
감사드립니다.
keynote speech
우리는
by
사회적 존재이고
Professor
인류에
Mark Yuno.
대한
Thank you very
진정한
much.
사랑과
So we
소속감으로
are social
타인에 대해
beings,
깊게
and we
경청하자는
need
메시지를
to listen
주셨습니다.
deeply to other people. That
이어서는
was the
특별
message
대담
by the
시간인데요.
professor. Now we
불교계에서는
have
어떻게
special
포스트 코로나
dialogue.
시대를
We'll talk
준비하고
about how
있는지를 이야기
Buddhism can help
나누어 보려고
reshape a
합니다.
better post-COVID
좌장에는
world.
쿠니히코 테라사와
So the
와트버그 대학교
moderator
부교수님이
is
함께
Dr. Kuniko
해주시고
Terasawa,
패널로는
Associate
기조
Professor
연설을
Wartburg
해주신 마크
College,
유노 미국
and the panelists
불교기독교학회
include
회장님
Dr. Mark Yuno,
모셨습니다.
President of
또
Society for
무라야마
Buddhist
하쿠카
Christian
세계
Studies,
불교도
and
청년의회
Reverend
회장님을
Hakuka
또 한
Murayama,
분의
the
패널로
President of World
모셨습니다.
Fellowship of
그럼
Buddhist
지금부터는
Youth.
특별 대담을
So
청해
now we are
듣겠습니다.
going to start the special dialogue.
Dr. Uno, can you hear?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you. I'm sorry. So Dr. Uno, thank you very much for your powerful, very impactful address. So you are very articulated, uniquely Buddhist way dealing with social justice, and in comparison to a secular social justice movement. It is not antithesis between two, but it's very complementary each other for the secular social justice movement and the Buddhist, Mahayana Buddhist viewpoint of the social justice movement. And you powerfully presented three examples from Reverend Grace Song and also Valerie Brown's and the Kyoto Mayumi-san's counseling example, which is very moving in our heart. Thank you very much. So before discussion, sometimes a little bit for the sake of audience, you both as Buddhist, what kind of activity you are doing? Very short. You share in the audience, very short, okay? For the sake of audience, who you are. First of all, I am a professor of the religion at the Woodward College, Iowa. I'm dealing with the interfaith dialogue between Christian and Buddhist in the local community. And okay, how about Dr. Murayama? Could you please explain what you are doing briefly?
Okay.
I translate you to English.
Yes, okay. Sorry for in Japanese. はい。はじめまして、村山博雅と申します。世界仏教徒青年連盟 The World Fellowship of Buddhist Youth の、プレジデント、会長を務めております。いわゆるこの度は仏教活動をする人間としてですね、様々な、経験についてお話ができたらありがたいというふうに存じ上げます。よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、Thank you. So he's Reverend Murayama. He's a president of Buddhist Youth organization. He's a president, and he's doing many Buddhist activity in local and worldwide level. So he tried to attend, to share his Buddhist activity. How about Dr. Uno? Could you speak a little bit about your kind of interface activity as a Buddhist?
Yes, so as the president of the Society for Buddhist Christian Studies, I'm privileged to work with many great colleagues, both Buddhist and Christian. And I have been involved in Buddhist Christian dialogue for many years. And there has been a development, which is initially there was much more conflict. And now we work much more closely with each other, learning from each other and learning with each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. According to the Dr. Uno's speech, very much emphasize of Mahayana Buddhist notion of emptiness and oneness. So it is not just a concept, but you told us a wonderful example of the Grace Son's ability to listen, ability to deeply listening, and also Dr. Sayumi, Kyoto University's Mayumi-san's very listening to create a space instead of just the theory of psychotherapeutic theory, but deep listening for the space, creating space for others to join. In other words, the beauty of silence, the importance of silence to listening, creating for space to other people to open their heart is a very beautiful notion that. But sometimes I wonder how social or justice movement, sometimes social justice movement is self-creating some polarity, dichotomy between the dualistic notion of good and evil, right and wrong, or justice, injustice. Sometimes, secular social justice movement is a great contribution, but sometimes both sides demonizing each other. It's a very, in the name of justice, sometimes creating lots of dichotomy. Of course, currently Russia, Ukraine's fighting, Putin has its own justice notion, it's a Russian justice, purification of the Ukraine soul. Ukraine was contaminated by the evil of the West. Therefore, Russia has to purify Ukraine's soul. So, of course, both sides has a justice, and such a dualistic notion of justice, injustice. How can we practically deal with those conflict? Particularly those who are dictatorship, like a Putin or Xi Jinping, or those oppressor. Secular social justice try to represent such a minority oppressed people, but the oppressor is an evil target of fighting. There is no notion of kind of salvation for all. Buddhism try to save not only oppressed, but also Buddhism believe those try to save those who are oppressing. So how to deal with practically those dichotomy? Do you have any suggestion or concrete suggestion or example? Mark, could you share?
Yes. So thank you so much. So I think true social justice that brings healing is very, very difficult. And I want to talk about two levels, big and small. And we see the small level in this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So we have received many reports where Ukraine and Ukrainian soldiers have encouraged Russian soldiers to surrender. And when they surrender, we hear many reports that the Ukraine government and Ukraine army and soldiers are treating the Russian soldiers with kindness and compassion. And that's very important, not just for victory, but for healing between Ukraine and Russia over the long term. At the big level, for there to be true and lasting social justice that brings healing, great leadership is important. And we can see in the contrasting styles between President Zelensky and Vladimir Putin in this regard. And we can look at historical examples. When India was trying to gain independence, Gandhi took the path of nonviolence and healing. And that was very powerful in bringing everyone together. And not just the peoples of India, but even many peoples who had been part of the occupying British Raj came to Gandhi's side. And so we can see the big level and the little level, the importance of great leadership, but also no small act of kindness goes unnoticed. Every small action matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very wonderful. Then, 村山さん、大体言ってることお分かりになりますかね。大体この世俗的正義の運動というのは、どちらかというと正義不正義、善と悪というね、その独裁者とか、その悪の支配者に対してどうしても戦いていくという方向になっていくわけですけれども、仏教徒の場合は少し違う意味でね、その独裁者をも救っていくということになるんですけれども、村山さん自身のその今の活動において、いろんな宗教者でないそういう世俗の方たちのね、社会正義の運動と一緒にやっているんですけれども、そこにおける違いといいますか、その仏教者として特別にですね、そういう世俗の方々の社会正義運動に対してどういうふうに関わり、それをまた限界点を超えていけるという何かを、そのエグザンプルが終わりになればありがたいんですけれども、そういう。
はい、先生が先ほどおっしゃった、両先生がおっしゃっていらっしゃいました、 空とか、傾聴とかっていう言葉で、さっきエンプティネスと、あとヒアリング・リスニングという言葉が出てこられましたけども、やっぱりこの菩薩道という一つの大きな大乗仏教のテーマの中では、重要な言葉だと思いますが、こういったものというものがですね、言ってみれば、私たちのプライドとして、行われていくということ、自尊心としてです。仏教徒としても。これがとても大事なことだなというふうに、気づかされましたのが、古くにジャワンネルダナ大統領が、スリランカの、外務大臣の時にね、来られまして、条約の時に、恨みは恨みでもって返してはならんというダンマパダの言葉を使われて、戦争責任の話をされたことがあったかと思うんですけども、それをですね、やはりスリランカの国民、仏教徒というものは、それを私たちのプライドにしているんだということをですね、断言をされていらっしゃったというところがですね、その世俗的な内容とも関わった上でですね、社会性のある仏教のあり方というものを如実に表していたんだなというふうに思っています。ですので、そういう政治への、そういう社会への、仏教の知恵の使い方というものは、やはり私たちがプライドを持つということが何よりも大事だと。なので、先ほどからお話をいただいている菩薩道だと一括して言えると思うんですが、菩薩道のあり方にしてみても、演技のあり方にしても、この空のあり方にしても、すべてが私たちが幸せを作るための大きなプライドの原動力になっているというふうに考えるというのが、とても私は大事なんだろうなと思っています。
Thank you, thank you. So Reverend Murayama talked about one example. When after World War II, Japan has a lot of aggression over East Asia and South Asia. Then at the time of the war responsibility, Japan has a lot of kind of a guilt to be declared. The time President of Sri Lanka, President Sri Lanka came to visit Japan, and saying that he said, "We do not revenge to the revenge. We do not anger to the angers." So there is a compassion to a forgiving way to do that. So he was so impressed. Then the unique way of Buddhist as a compassion and interdependent co-arising. Everything is interconnected. Their problem is my problem. My problem is their problem. A kind of a way of dealing as a uniquely Buddhist way, a Buddhist country. So he really realized. So this is the way to deal with social problem as a Buddhist pride of kind of compassion and interdependent co-arising, everything oneness. This approach is very important as a Buddhist. Thank you, thank you. So, Mr. Murayama, for example, in your dealing with young people, particularly Buddhist youth, so in Japan or Asia, in all over the world, especially for young people you are dealing with as a Buddhist. So would you be a little bit explain your kind of example, how the young people, who are typically people say young people are less religious, or but this is a kind of stereotype of young generation, but you are dealing with youth, Buddhist youth. How could you organize or plan or envision for Buddhist youth, not only in Japan, but Asia, to dealing with justice in the world? 大体わかりますか？
はい、わかります。大体。はい。そうですね。ちょっとあれ、長くならないように、させていただこうと思いますが、私たちも、今コロナだからこそ話せる 話になってくるかと思うんですけれども、このコロナが始まった2019年にですね、もう最後の活動、春に終わってしまいまして、対面活動ですね。でその後、やはり地域それぞれの方々に対しての支援というものがずっと続けられてきて、私たち海外のネットワークでの活動というのは自粛をしなくてはならないようなムードでずっと参りました。じゃあ、ここで一回切りますね。はい。
So, Mr. Murayama talking about he's dealing with a pandemic situation and very much isolated situation by each individual or community. So therefore, he tried to, as a Buddhist, try to deal with this long isolated area to approach to the people. But because of pandemic, it is very difficult to do. But now he tried to reapproach again. Okay.
そうですね。で、この2年間っていうのは、そういった意味で、海外とかにはアイソレイトな、いわゆる分断した状態になったわけですけども、地域においては、改めて確認を、関係性の確認をできるという時期でもあったかと思いますが、この上でですね、ずっと、いたならばですね、長にも長かったので、この国際的なネットワークが、やはり自分たちを見つめるための大きな、鏡になるものなんですね。自分たちだけを見ていると、どうしても自分たちだけで分断されて、新しい、先ほどの、ロシアの戦争も、歴史が培ってきた独自の価値意識が、それぞれで動き出すと、そのヒアリングができなくなってしまうところからの大きな動きに変わっていくという。私は、戦争についても、コロナのことが原因の一端にあるんではないかというふうに、すごく思うところなんですが、そんな意味合いでですね、それまで、オンラインの技術というのがどんどん出てきました。ですので、そのオンラインの技術を使ってですね、昨年、改めてたくさんのみんな若い人たちを集めてですね、このオンラインにおける国際交流会をやろうということで、それまで対面で行ってきていた、国際仏教と青年交換プログラム、インターナショナル・ブディスト・ユース・エクチェンジというですね、プログラムを、オンラインで初めて再開をさせていただきました。はい。ここまで。
So, because of the isolated pandemic situation, it's very difficult just reflecting ourselves without communicating others. That's why now he's tried to have an international network, Japanese Buddhist and Sri Lanka Buddhist and Myanmar Buddhist. So therefore, this is very international network through the Zoom and internet. He had a international Buddhist youth conference by Zoom 2 months ago. This is a very good to not just reflecting ourselves. So each mirror, you can reflect your own mirror through the international network, you know. It is a very effective and meaningful, and that's why he tried to do it again. Okay,
Yes.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Mark, Dr. Uno, so you as a professor and your Oregon is one of the most open-minded state. Lots of new religion, Buddhist and Christianity mingles. So how would you as a professor, but also you are the Jodo Shinshu Pure Land Buddhist priest. So how would you doing such a post-pandemic community project? Could you share a little bit?
Yes. So I think that in my own work, there are 3 things I can say. First, I act within the context of being a professor. Second, I also act within the context of being a Buddhist priest. And third, what does this mean in the larger scope of society? So as a professor, I think one of the places where I have the greatest influence is as a teacher. And I try to teach courses that bring students from all different kinds of backgrounds, religious backgrounds, different genders, different races, and we read materials from many different backgrounds. The college or university classroom setting is one of those places where young people have the opportunity and are willing to form bridges of communication and bridges of understanding across many differences, and to provide a space for deep listening and deep hearing to each other. And for me to listen deeply to the ideas, interests, as well as suffering of my students is a great learning opportunity for me. In the Buddhist context also, so Shin Buddhism came to the US through Japanese immigrants to the US, and I work with many temples whose membership is mostly Japanese American. But I also work with many Buddhist events and groups that are not limited to Japanese Americans or to Asian Americans. People who have not heard of Buddhism or Shin Buddhism before, and who come from many different backgrounds. And that's not only important for me to share, but also learning from these many different kinds of people. And then there are other moments where we have opportunities. So as president of the Society for Buddhist Christian Studies, I'm encouraging our society to be more diverse in our leadership, in our board of directors, to be represented by different women and men, to be gender inclusive, to be represented by people of different racial, ethnic backgrounds, and sexual orientation. So a person who is in a leadership position has great responsibility to bring people together from many different backgrounds. And it requires encouraging people, but also connecting with people feeling like they're welcome. And they're not going to feel welcome unless you can open your own heart and listen to see what it is that they wish to accomplish. So I think there's a structural level, and then there's the individual level. Individual level is easier to influence. You can see results more quickly because people want to go deeper and develop. Structural change takes more time, but we cannot ignore the structural level also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, it's a very, Dr. Uno's mention. So structural change and individual change. This is a very important for the social justice issues. So Buddhism tends to focus on individual change. Unless you change, you cannot change the world, you know. Very much focus on individual or transformation or enlightenment. But sometimes the structural change in social, political, international relation, structural change. So Christianity, for example, they have their own kind of theology of liberation theology, 解放神学ですね。It's borrowing from Marxist class analysis and structural change. Sometimes too much, but you know, liberation theology, something like this. How about Buddhism? You know, the Buddhism has been focused on very famous in personal transformation, the enlightenment. But what kind of wisdom, Buddhist wisdom, in terms of structural change? Do you have any insight how Buddhism can contribute for structural change? It's a little bit a big topic. Okay, Dr. Uno?
Yes. So in order to respond to this question, it's important to understand the different histories of Christianity and Buddhism.
Yes.
Christianity and other monotheistic religions like Islam and Judaism present a comprehensive worldview. from the time you're born to coming of age, marriage, to death. That's the reason why you can't be both Christian and Jewish at the same time, or both Christian and Islam. Because they're comprehensive worldviews, it's very difficult to belong to two at the same time. Buddhism and religions in Asia generally have a different history. So many Chinese have been both Confucian and Taoist. Many Japanese have been Buddhist and Shinto. And that's because religions in Asia have been more role-based. You go to Shinto wedding, go to Buddhist funeral, you're
That's
Confucian at work, you're Taoist in the evening. Okay. And for that reason, what has happened as religions moved across Asia, and Buddhism is the biggest missionary religion in Asia, is Buddhism tended to more coexist with other religions because they have different roles. And so when social problems arose, they tended to be addressed on a local level, more than institutional level. But as Christianity moved across Europe, especially when Catholicism moved across Europe, because it's a comprehensive worldview, it tended to displace local pre-existing religions. And then when social problems arose, then there was a need to create an institution that took care of them. So for example, what happened when people went crazy? Then you had to create eventually first a ship of fools, then warehouses on the outskirts of city, then psychiatric wards. This contrasts with the case of Asia, and I know Japan the best, where if the local Buddha was the Buddha, the medicine Buddha, then often families would take in people who we would consider today to have mental illness, and would take care of them because that's what the Buddha would want. So we have to understand the different histories, and they have their own strengths and weaknesses, because now the whole world is modernizing, westernizing. That means we need more institutional structural solutions. And Christianity has a very effective history of that. And so we need to learn from Christians. But at the same time, there's something about local organic response to social issues, coming from the grassroots level, respecting the indigenous culture that can help provide solutions that come from the community itself. And so I think we can actually learn from both Christianity and Buddhism. We need top-down structural change, but we also need to draw on local grassroots indigenous communities for solutions. And this applies to things like poverty. It applies to things like food security or food insecurity, and also regional conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Dr. Uno, you have very eloquently explained about Buddhist wisdom from bottom up, the local context. So, Reverend Murayama, この仏教は個人的なこの悟りとかですね、自己の変革ってことに対してとても多くの知恵を持っているんですけどね、政治的社会的改革、この構造の改革っていう点においてですね、ちょっと歴史的に遠い面というかですね、があったんですけれども、その歴史的、政治的、その経済的な問題の構造改革っていう観点で、例えば村山先生とそのユースグループは何かそこに、なさろうとなさる方向性とかビジョンとかございますんでしょうか。
かなり具体的だと難しい質問になるんですけれども、そうですね。ただ、次世代を担う方々に対しての働きかけというものは、必ずというかもうとにかくだんだんですね、もっともっと大事になってくる時代が来ている中でですね、この今おっしゃってるその仏教というものの知恵の社会化というものは、もう何よりも率先して私たち仏教徒は行っていかなきゃならないものだという、そういう自覚はもちろん持っています。ですので、 仏教を通じた、言語を超えたコミュニケーションができる団体としての事業をですね、これは対面だから可能なんですよ。こういう言語の壁があると、まあ、これからは翻訳の機会とかいっぱい出てくるとは思うんですけれども、それ以前に、その仏教という価値観を通じて、それぞれが言葉が、はっきり分かってなくてもコミュニケーションができる、そういう機会をですね、どんどん作っていくことは、私はこの世界仏教にとって何よりも大事なのだと実感で感じているような次第です。ちょっとお答えにはなってないかもしれません。
Thank you very much. Yeah, Reverend Murayama says it is critically important for next generation and how the Buddhist wisdom, how socialized, how Buddhist wisdom can be social as to be a social Buddhist wisdom. So Buddhist Murayama Sensei and his group are really try to focus for the next young people how Buddhist wisdom can be as a social Buddhist wisdom. They try to expand Buddhist wisdom to social or political context for the next generation. It is a wonderful attempt. Thank you very much. So we have the 6 minutes left. So any question from audience or any question from each other? Or if Murayama-san or Dr. Uno have a question too? I'm just playing the questioner. So that the audience can ask a question as we have 6 minutes left. I heard there are 100 Korean, Japan audience there. Oh, yes, Dr. Uno.
One thing I would like to briefly mention is that there's a difference between established schools of Buddhism in Asia, including Korea and Japan, and new forms of Buddhism that have arisen in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. And I think Won Buddhism and in Japan, Rissho Koseikai are very good representatives of new forms of Buddhism that arose in an environment where there was already possibilities for democracy and social change that's different from traditional forms of Buddhism that were tied to royal and imperial forms of government. And we have much to learn from both Won Buddhism and other similar forms of Buddhism like Rissho Koseikai, who do both the grassroots bottom-up work, but also have engaged in structural change. And so I'm very much looking forward to learning from my colleagues in Won Buddhism in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Indeed, Won Buddhism and Rissho Koseikai are the most active active in inter-religious dialogue. Inter-religious dialogue, we really appreciate. So Murayama-san, you are the Zen Buddhist.
Yes.
So you are long in the mountain Eheji.
Yes.
Yes. And Dogen.
Yes.
Dogen's, you are inherited the Dogen's Kesmyak.
Yes.
So it is a very appreciated the traditional Buddhism, and also as a Zen Buddhist, you also you are kind of interreligious 宗教対話で何かこうされていることはございますか？
参画はしているんですが、中心になって行っている活動は今のところないと認識しています。大変難しい、インターフェースというのは大変難しい活動であるという中で、やはりいろいろと問題があるのかなと思います。
なるほど、なるほどね。はい。So, for the organization, the public organization is not doing the interface, but they try to. That's why more you are focused on more intra dialogue within Buddhism, you know. So he tried to do intra among Buddhists, you know, or he tried to representing very traditional, important Buddhist tradition. So we also can learn from Dr. Uno's paper mentioned about Dogens, you know, in order to find the true self is to forget yourself, you know. It's a very important notion of emptiness and oneness. So we want to learn from Murayama Sensei. Please let us keep in touch. Okay. Thank you very much. And we have a wonderful presentation and the discussions. I really appreciate your attendance. Thank you very much. 감사합니다. 감사합니다.
특별 대담을 잘 들었습니다. 특별
Thank you for
대담에서도
the
깊은
special
경청에
dialogue
대한 말씀을
session. We
이어가셨는데요.
heard about
깊은
deep
경청은 다른
listening.
사람을 위한 공감을
It's
만드는 것으로
about
침묵의
sharing with
아름다움이다라는
others.
메시지를
It's
전해주셨습니다.
beautiful moment of
무엇보다
silence. Thank you for
코로나19는
that
종교의
message.
역할을 찾아주는 계기가
In the
되었다고도 할
pandemic,
수 있습니다.
maybe
코로나
religions
이후의
found
삶으로
their
향하고
role.
있는 사람들에게
Many people
위로와
are now
안정을
facing post-pandemic
제공해주고
era.
또 근원적인
Religions can
문제
be source of
해결을 제공해
consolation
줄
and
수 있는
stability.
불교의 지혜와
Religions,
종교의 역할을 기대해
Buddhism
보겠습니다.
can
그럼
provide the
지금부터는
fundamental
잠시 휴식을
solution.
갖도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you for the
다음
session.
평화
We will now have a
대화
break.
세션은 11시
The next
45분에
session begins
시작하겠습니다.
at
잠시 휴식 시간
11:45.
가지시고 11시 45분에 다시
11:45.
찾아뵙겠습니다.
See you soon.
감사합니다.
Thank you.